Hey now, and welcome back to the DrupalEasy podcast. This is season 15, episode number 6. This is the final episode of season 15. In today's episode, we'll be talking with Cameron Eagans, maintainer of the Composer Patches plugin. We'll be talking about the past, present, and future of this beloved Composer plugin that is used by literally thousands and thousands of Drupal developers every single day. Before we get to the interview, let me briefly remind you about Drupal Career Online, DrupalEasy's 12-week Drupal beginner training program. This class is offered 2 half-days a week, plus office hours for a few hours a week. And this course is now in its 12th year and provides best practice-focused training for aspiring Drupal professionals. Class begins August 28th. You can learn more at drupaleasy.com/DCO. Welcome to the DrupalEasy podcast. Cameron, how are you? Nice to meet you.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
I don't think we've met in the past, have we?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so. So for those of you who haven't met Cameron either, so Cameron Eagans, you are the maintainer of the Composer Patches Composer plugin that, I'm not going to say it's all Drupal developers use, but the vast majority of Drupal developers that I interact with utilize the Composer Patches plugin. So first off, let me just say thank you for that.
Thanks for that. I'm really happy that the plugin has been so widely used.
Do you feel pressure from having a plugin that so many Drupal sites depend on?
Oh, for sure. Sometimes,
Yeah.
it's gotten some use outside the Drupal community too. I don't know. It seems like every commit, it's like, am I going to break somebody's workflow? Is this going to be a really bad day for somebody?
I was going to ask you about that in a moment, but since you brought it up, let me ask now, do you have, or what type of indications do you have about how much it's used outside of the Drupal community?
I don't have a good indication of exactly how much or how widely used it is outside the Drupal community, but I know that I've gotten issues from like the Typo 3 community and Magento and I mean just kind of using like the GitHub code search.
Right.
See, it gets pulled into composer.json all over the place.
So I believe that when you and I were exchanging emails about this, I believe you told me that you're not actually a Drupal developer anymore, at least. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I have sort of changed technology entirely.
Right.
I haven't done Drupal in, I don't know, 8-9 months now.
How about PHP?
Nope, completely hands off. I switched over to Go and DevOps, and it's been kind of a nice change of pace.
Yeah, I think you may have just made everyone who depends on your plugin a little bit nervous with that statement, but we'll get to that in a moment. So let's give your company a little bit of a plug. You're currently a staff DevOps engineer at Swirlds Lab. Am I saying that right? SWIRLDS?
Yep.
So what does Swirlds Labs do?
So Swirlds Labs works on the Hedera cryptocurrency.
Okay.
We have a contract with the Hedera Foundation to provide software engineering and DevOps services, among other things. So I primarily work on the DevOps side of the world. So help to make sure the Hedera network stays up and running and healthy, and we help kind of coordinate the releases to the various networks every month.
All right. So I want to switch back to Composer Patches. What is it? Like for someone who is new to Composer Patches, has never used it, has no idea what we're talking about yet, how would you describe Composer Patches to kind of an entry-level Drupal developer?
Sure. So I guess if you kind of think about the best case scenario workflow with Composer, you're working on your project and you need to pull in some version of some library, and you can just do that. After you've done that, maybe you find a bug or you need a new feature out of that library. So you make those changes and you contribute them back upstream, and then nothing. The maintainer is MIA or on vacation, or I don't know, just doesn't maintain the project anymore or whatever. But I mean, at the end of the day, you still got a deadline to make, and you need this thing to work. So composer patches is a mechanism to take those changes and incorporate them into your project without necessarily needing to have those changes upstreamed in your dependencies, or some people sort of rely on making a fork of the upstream dependency and keeping their changes there, and that's just kind of a pain in the neck.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that what Composer Patches does is something that could be done manually, but Composer Patches just kind of automates the process of you specify the patch that you want to apply to the project or the upstream dependencies or the project dependency. And Composer Patches just kind of does it. Anytime you run, and correct me if I'm wrong, a composer require, composer update, or composer remove command. Do I have that right?
You have that right for version 1. It's a little bit more explicit in version 2.
All right.
So there isn't quite so much, assuming how you're using Composer. There's explicit commands to apply a patch or repatch all the stuff in your project.
So for someone who uses Composer Patches in its simplest form, they save some patches to a patches directory in the project root. They add the extras configuration to their composer.json, and they run composer install the first time to get that patch applied.
Mm-hmm.
For someone who just does that, sets it up, can they just go about their business and have confidence that that patch will be applied as they expect, or is there something new that they're going to have to do in the future based in 2.0 based on what you just said?
In 2.0, if you've gone through the process of adding the patch to your project, every time you do a composer install, the patch will be applied. It's more like if you do a composer require, composer update, or whatever, it's not going to change the patch or do anything fancy. Like it's not going to break your composer workflows. Is kind of the goal.
Okay. I do want to talk about one statistic that I saw, and I believe it was on your website, cweegans.net, where you have a blog about composer patches, or I don't know if you call it a blog, but there's some updates that you put there. But one of the numbers I saw was that it's currently getting over 40,000 installs every day,
Yeah.
which that's a huge number.
Yeah. It's it's just a mind-boggling amount of use.
I don't really have a question, but I did want to say it out loud just so folks can appreciate like how many folks, how many people are using this plugin.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm really glad that Packagist exposes those statistics.
Yeah.
It's kind of a good motivator. It's like 44 million cumulative installs over the course of 6 years or something. So yeah, I don't know. Like looking at it is just sort of motivating. If I just stopped maintaining the plugin, like it would not be a good situation.
No. So how did you get started with this? Were you just scratching an itch, or did you take over another project? Or like how did this all start for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned earlier that it could very well be a manual step, and
Mm-hmm.
it was at the time. It was a very painful manual step. We tried writing a little bash script to automate it, but people would forget to run it or whatever, and it was just not a pleasant experience. So at the time, I was working for NBC Universal, and they had sort of an internal Drupal 7 based distribution for all of their various brands. The project that I was brought on for was to essentially port that distribution to Drupal 8, and this was in the really early days of Drupal 8. We started at like Drupal 8 Alpha 2 or something.
Oh, okay. Pre-release.
Yeah. So we, naturally depended on a lot of modules that, if they were ported to Drupal 8, they were only done there. That was only done in a patch in the issue queue. And so we'd like pull in the Drupal 7 version of the module and then apply this patch to port it to Drupal 8. It was
That got old real
not a
fast,
pleasant
I bet. Yeah.
experience. Oh yeah. And since it was more or less a greenfield project, we were really committed to making sure that we're going to use Composer, and we're going to make sure there's good test coverage and stuff, and you just sort of enforce good engineering practices from the beginning. So, we were pulling in all the dependencies with Composer, and we needed to be able to apply the patches. So it was kind of just a, let's see if this can even work sort of task that was assigned. And it turns out it can.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Is this something that you just took on yourself, or was this a task that was assigned to you in a very open-ended way, saying, figure out a way to make this better? Or was it specifically go write a Composer plugin to make this better?
It was, if I recall correctly, it was sort of a research ticket.
Ah.
It was like, how can our workflow not suck? It was sort of the gist of it. But yeah, so I spent a little bit of time on it, found out that you could write Composer plugins, and
And there you
just
go. Yeah.
kind of went from there.
So there's a 2.0 release coming up. What can we expect? You mentioned it a minute ago, but kind of give us more of a big picture.
Sure. So 2.0 for me is a couple of big things. So one is that dependency patch resolution is going away. The process of discovering patches that are defined in the dependencies that are pulled into your project. And I think we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the thing that sort of goes hand in hand with that is that Composer patches itself is now extensible. So if you if you really need dependency patch resolution or some other way of discovering patches for your project, you can write a little Composer plugin that extends Composer patches, and it'll just kind of like plug into the main process. And then the third thing was sort of maintainability and really thorough testing and things like that. From my perspective, the 1.x branch was just really fragile, and it was really I don't know, anxiety inducing to make big changes to it, or even just little changes that could potentially have weird side effects.
It seems like you have made the decision that you want to continue to own and but maintain Composer patches, but you want to set it up for the long haul.
Yeah.
And from what I've read and what you've just told us, number one, that means getting rid of dependency patch resolution, which you've written a blog post about it and how it has been the root cause of many of the issues in the issue queue for Composer patches. But also, adding the testing and making it extensible so that, as you said, if someone needs to do something outside of the 80% of all use cases, they can write code that, as you said, will hook into Composer patches to allow them to do that. So it kind of takes the onus for all of those edge cases off of you and allows other folks to do what they need to do, interoperate with Composer patches while not adding code to Composer patches that could potentially make it buggy or unusable or unstable for other users.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Just sort of making it a really strong foundation that does, a couple of the really straightforward cases, and then has extension points for all of the special stuff that people want to do.
Are there other maintainers or other active contributors more than just like one off here and there? Do you have folks that actively work with you on issues?
Yeah. So Dane Powell is another Drupal person. Um, he now has commit access to the repository,
Oh,
so he's able to make changes. So I just added him earlier this year, I think. So that's been really helpful, just knowing there's somebody else sort of keeping an eye on things. And there's also sort of a core group of you know users of the plugin, I guess, that make good bug reports or good suggestions about how to approach a problem, and I'm really grateful for those people taking the time to be involved.
yeah, it must have been a huge relief and probably a little bit of anxiety in adding, that first co-committer with you.
Yeah, I've had a couple of requests over the years, like can I be a co-maintainer, and it's always been kind of one of those, well, okay, yeah, work on some issues or open some pull requests or whatever, and we'll go from there. But, Dane actually did that, which was really nice. He's a good guy.
Very good. And when can we expect 2.0? 2.0.0?
Um,
Do you have a goal
well,
or?
previously my answer was when it's ready,
Sure. Okay.
but I, I'm I guess the thing that I was sort of waiting for is for people to test it and try to use it in their projects.
Let me ask the most important question of that. If someone wants to test it, other than installing the new version, well, if there are in the 80% use case where they've added some patches to their composer .json file, do they have to change anything other than getting the new version? Should it just work as is?
It should just work. 2.0 is backwards compatible with the same, patch definitions that were in your composer.json or in your patches.json if you're using an external file.
Right.
It has some extra stuff if you want to define things in a fancy way, but you shouldn't have to change anything other than the version of composer patches that's pulled into your project.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's probably a very nice thing for people to hear. And I think from the other side of it, if people are testing it, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you would love for them to give you feedback in the issue queue, even if there's no problems.
Yeah.
Because I think if you get a lot of feedback saying I'm using Composer 2.0, there's no issues, I didn't have to change anything. This is a summary of my setup. That's valuable data as well. You just don't want to hear about issues. You want to hear about successes so you can kind of gauge, do we have 90% successes and 10% issues? Okay, well, that tells us something.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I suspect that a number of projects won't be able to upgrade because they rely on that dependency patch resolution functionality.
Sure.
But it's sort of a chicken and egg problem, right? Like whoever wants to write the plugin that provides that functionality is probably not going to do so until Composer Patches 2.0 is out. But people won't be able to test 2.0 until that plugin exists.
Yeah, I had heard about that you could do that you could put patch metadata in a dependencies composer.json file, but for some reason it never felt right. It never felt like I would. That's something I wanted to do because to me it felt like something could get lost through slip through the cracks, or I don't even know the answer to this, and I'm not looking for you to answer. But like in my head, I'm like, well, what would happen if I'm applying a patch, or this dependency A is applying a patch to the same dependency that my core or my root composer.json is? I'm sure I'm going to get a patch will not apply error or something like that. So for me, it was always just like, I'm aware of that functionality, but I don't want to add that complexity to my life. But from what you're saying and from what I've read in your articles, it seems like it's probably not a significant number, but there is a non-zero number of people who do use that dependency patch resolution.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's it's probably a more significant number than you'd think. It's surprisingly widely used.
Really?
And if you go look at the
Okay.
if you go look at the discussions in the GitHub repo, there's a thread in there about like we use this for this reason and all that. But like a really common use case is there's some Drupal contrib module that depends on a core patch. There's like core functionality
Oh,
being
okay.
developed in
Yep.
tandem with
Hmm.
some contrib module. So in order for this thing to even work at all, like core has to be patched,
Right.
which that's fine. That's how stuff gets fixed in core too.
I'm going to play devil's advocate. With 40,000 installs per day, I would still argue, or I put money on that. The number of folks using dependency patch resolution is the vast minority of those 40,000 installs per day.
Yeah,
And granted, that 40,000 installs per day is not 40,000 people per day. That's just how many times that packages is getting hit with it or something like that.
yeah,
And I'm not trying to talk you out of what you've done by any stretch. I actually think it's a great idea. I like simpler modules that have the functionality if someone else wants to extend it. I believe modules should be small and focused and rock solid. And I think that's kind of what you're going for with 2.0 by removing this feature slash functionality.
Yeah, it's this is something that I've gone back and forth on a lot. The people that rely on the dependency patch resolution functionality is it's definitely the minority of the overall users of the plugin,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a big enough number that I went back and forth on whether or not to remove this functionality for a long time.
Yeah, it seemed like it from the blog post you wrote, and then I went into some of the issues and was poking around in there, and it does not seem like it was an easy decision.
No, no, and I'm still kind of trying to let go of like I feel bad about breaking people's workflow, but ultimately like it's not something that I can commit to maintaining, and
Right.
if it stays in, like I don't know how much maintenance Composer patches is going to get. It's like that. It was hugely demotivating to just trip on the same issues over and over and over again.
Well, I think it's a great decision. I mean, there is not that you're looking for approval from me by any stretch of the imagination. But when I read it, I'm like, okay, that seems like a very like a mature decision, right? From your standpoint, I could imagine that you want to continue maintaining it. You've gotten a lot of joy and personal satisfaction out of maintaining it, except for this one thing that's kind of dragging it down.
Mm-hmm.
And if this one thing can be removed and have someone else pick up on that, and you provide the necessary hook so that they can write something that can hook into Composer patches, I think everybody wins. Granted, there's going to have to be a small group of people who maybe come together and write the plugin for dependency patch resolution. And maybe they're going to need your help here or there, or maybe they're going to ask you to, you know, I don't know, for something, but that seems a lot more maintainable and sustainable than the path it sounds like you were on before.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess on that topic before we move away, I mentioned this in the blog post, but if one or many people are interested in actually writing that plugin, definitely reach out. I'm happy to spend some time, sort of discussing some of the edge cases and weird things that need to be handled, help answer questions about why it's tricky. It can be something that seems simple on its face and then gets a lot more complex when you get into it.
All right. Well, anybody wants a challenge, contact Cameron. So let's finish up. And this is something I've learned, I would say maybe the past year and a half. And I don't think this is as widely known as it should be. And this has to do with one of the best practices of Composer patches. And I think I actually learned this from a blog post or a session from Tim Lennon from the DA, who mentioned that you should never link to a patch directly from Drupal.org. You should always download that patch, save it on your local as a static, patch file, and allow Composer patches to utilize that. I'm going to assume that's something that you completely agree with. Are there pros and cons for doing it that way? And are there any other best practices that you would recommend, but you don't necessarily folks using all the time?
As a recommendation, downloading your patches and applying them locally is not it's not like bad advice. And like if you just do that with all of your patches, it's fine. The biggest reason to do that is if you so GitLab and GitHub, if you have a merge request or a pull request respectively, you can tack on .patch to the end of the URL and get a patch file of all the changes in that merge request or pull request. People have used that as the URL to the patch in their composer.json, and then when somebody pushes new changes to that merge request, suddenly their patch is different. So somebody malicious could like
That's
push
scary.
changes to the
Yes.
pull request, right? and then it's your project
Right.
is just hosed. So it certainly, if you're using merge request or pull request URLs in your project, like don't do that. Download the patches, apply them locally. Patches that were uploaded directly to Drupal.org are a little bit different. Once those are there, they're there, right? And there's a little bit more friction to, changing the content of those files. It would have to be somebody that has administrative access to Drupal.org. And
Right. And I think Tim's point was, at least partially because to reduce the server load on Drupal.org.
um, it's been a while since I've worked on Drupal.org, but I think most of those files are served through the CDN. If that's the recommendation from the DA, like, do that. If that makes a big impact to the DA's hosting costs or CDN costs or whatever, like, yeah, absolutely download your patches. All of that said, Composer Patches 1.x was very simplistic in its mechanism for, if it's a remote patch, we're going to download it and then just apply it to the project. Composer Patches 2 is a little bit smarter about things. So every patch that you apply to your project, local or not, when you apply it, the SHA-256 of that patch is going to be saved into a patches.log file.
Oh, wow.
So if the content of your like pull request patch file changes, you'll know, because Composer Patches is going to ring the alarm bells and complain really loudly about it. And so the security aspect of that particular recommendation is maybe a little less severe in 2.0.
Yeah, that's a nice little feature.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I wanted to do in 1.x, but it's just too fragile.
Are there any other best practices for using Composer Patches that you would like to see more people implement?
Honestly, I don't know that I don't know that I'm really the best person to prescribe those best practices. So a lot of the best practices are sort of emergent, right? Like you
Right.
discover them from actually working on real projects that have Composer Patches installed, and like I don't anymore.
Well, but it could also be that when you wrote the plugin, you intended it to be used one way, but now it's being used a different way. I don't think that's the case, but I figured since I had you here, I might as well ask.
Yeah, no, I mean, people use it in mostly predictable ways.
Okay.
I guess the big thing that has come up multiple times is like if you're using, I don't know, say Drupal 10, and you want to pull in a module where the composer.json requires Drupal 9, like you can't patch that module's composer.json.
Right. Yeah.
It's just the way that Composer works doesn't let you do that. So that's really the only like big thing to keep in mind, I think.
There is, I believe, isn't there there's a mechanism that somehow gets around that. I can't think of what it is off the top of my head.
Yeah, there was some blog post about it. I think I might have it linked in the documentation for Composer Patches.
All right. I'll find it and I'll put it in the show notes. So don't worry about that right now.
Oh yeah, okay. It's in the non-patchable targets page. James William wrote an article about it.
All right. I think that's everything I wanted to ask you. So look, I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. And thank you very much from myself, and I'm sure a heck of, well, probably 40,000 users a day. Well, maybe not users a day, but a heck of a lot of PHP developers out there who depend on your plugin. So thank you for your continued support and maintenance of the project. And just know you've got a lot of people out here who really appreciate what you do.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show.
All right. Thanks, Cameron. Thanks for listening to the DrupalEasy podcast. Don't forget to check out all of our long-form Drupal training courses at DrupalEasy.com. See ya!